Hello there, I am Zolerla, and this is The Joy of Computer Gaming, where we investigate good and intriguing examples of computer gaming history. Today's highlighted game is M.U.L.E, the make massive amounts of money by manufacturing a mule to mine minerals from a meteorite game. It's an economic strategy, kinda board game-ish game created by Ozark Softscape and published by Electronic Arts on the Atari 8-bit in 1983. It came out later that year on the Commodore 64, in 1985 for the PC, and much later on the NES in 1990. This video is going to be a bit long because it is a complex game, especially for its time, and because it is my favorite 8-bit game. This game is so different and unique that even after all these years, I have never played anything else quite like it. It is a fun game that my wife and I play a game of every few months or so, and that's saying quite a lot for a computer game I first played about 34 years ago. After playing a game to record for this video, we decided to play another one just for the fun of it. M.U.L.E is best described as being similar to a board game, but with liberties taken where a board game could not do the job. The game is fundamentally about a group of colonists on a remote world staking land claims and building multiple-use labor elements, or mules for short, outfitted to gather one of four resources: food, energy, smith ore, or crystite. The goal is to come out on top at the end of 12 months so you can be the first founder. You do this economically by manipulating the other players, cornering a market or two, or simply producing the right resources at the right time. And unlike most other games, there's no violence at all in M.U.L.E. There are always 4 players, with AI opponents filling in when there are not enough human players. From the beginning, the game was designed with the Atari 800's capabilities in mind. The game is done with solid colors and symbols to represent most aspects of the game. You quickly learn the symbols for the 4 resources. The world map is easy to discern since only a river and some mountains mark the terrain. Everybody's plots are very clearly marked with their color. Each player has a single color sprite based on the race you chose at the beginning of the game. Most of the races are purely aesthetic, though 2 do something special, which I'll get to later. Apparently they got the idea from the simple metal tokens you use for your character in Monopoly, allowing you to pick a race that you like the look of. The look of the mules themselves were inspired by AT-ATs from Star Wars. Quantities for the auction are accompanied with simple bars making a bar graph. Dashed lines show where the desired quantities are for energy or food so players can easily see how far above or below the goal is for the expendable resources. However simple the game may look, many additional flourishes and extras were added to make it feel more complete. There is a transition from the store to the overworld map and vice versa. The bars slide up or down when showing shifting values, accompanied with a little sound. There are progress bars shown that tick down when time is running out. Dashed lines show where the top of purchasing and the bottom of selling are, so it's easy to tell when they're getting close to meeting. Outfitting a mule slides up and changes to match your color. When viewing the scoreboard each month, your characters walk into position instead of just starting there. A player's turn events are all simply text, as most of them are abstract and talk about things beyond what you could see in the game, such as winning a beauty contest or your mules needing repairs. On the other hand, all of the monthly events are animated. One thing you can do is catch a wampus for cash, and since that has a full-screen image that looks like your character got a photograph with the wampus, it's always memorable. You land on planet Irata, which is simply Atari backwards, to create a seed colony with only a central store that can create and outfit mules to get you going. The store is always placed on a long river, and there are a few mountains all around you. This causes the only 3 terrain types: a river, plains, and mountains. You'll find out during the course of play that the world is quite alive and a number of creatures will be encountered, though mostly through text. There are mountain wampuses, bat lizards, moose rats, wartworms, glack elves, cat bugs, and simple pests as creatures you'll witness in the game. Get over the fauna on the world and you still get to deal with planet quakes, meteor strikes, acid rainstorms, radiation, and occasional pirates. Most of these details of the world are pretty simple and are only experienced through events in the game, though I am still curious what a mountain wampus is and why it has a treasure chest to give you to let it go free. The controls are really simple, but they change depending on what phase of the game you're in. In the land grant, you just press a button while the box is highlighting the space you want. In auctions, you move up or down to raise or lower your price. With a paddle, you can just spin to move up or down. When it's a development phase, you use a joystick to move about in all 4 directions. If you are using a paddle, you will use the first player's joystick to move around during this phase. The button is used for placing and picking up mules, and that's it. Otherwise, on-screen prompts will let you know when you need to press a button to proceed. There isn't much of a UI except to show you bits of information about the screen. Your money shows up anytime you would buy or sell anything. Little bars appear on the right showing timers counting down as applicable. and most of the information presented is pretty easy to understand at a first glance. There are 4 icons you will have to learn while playing, which represent the 4 resources. Aside from smith ore and crystite looking a bit similar, they're pretty easy to figure out. The mechanics of the game are where M.U.L.E really shines. There are so many factors going on in the game that the creators of the game realized it was hard to get into at first and created multiple difficulty modes. I'll touch on the differences between them later, but for the most part you'll want to play the complete game on the tournament difficulty, and my description is going to go into detail on how that works. The game takes place across 12 turns or months. The ship drops you off and month 1 begins. Each month progresses through phases: land grant, development, production, auction, and status summary. Each month starts with the land grant phase, where everyone can pick 1 plot of land to take. This is done by having a highlight move across the available tiles and pressing your button to select the spot you want. Since the highlight moves fairly quickly, this can unfortunately be a little annoying at times as well. If multiple players try to take the same spot at the same time, the player trying with the lowest total score gets it. After all 4 players have selected a spot, or the highlight has passed all of the tiles, the selection part ends. Randomly, some unowned plots may be auctioned by the store. The manual says up to 6 may be sold in a single month, but I've never seen more than 3. These operate just like any other auction without a maximum price, as I'll explain later. There are only 44 plots available, 4 of which have the river running through them. The remainder are either plains if they have no mountains, or mountainous if they do. On the first turn you generally want to get a plains or river plot since you need those throughout the entire game. The next phase is development, where each individual player will take a turn using the store to purchase mules, equip them, assay land, sell land, or they may pick up or place mules from the map, or even try to hunt down the Wumpus. This is where most of the game will be, especially with 3 or 4 human players. It's also the most complicated phase of the game. The turn order will go from the highest score player down to the lowest score player, unless the store has less than 8 mules in stock, in which case it will go in the inverse order to allow lower scoring players a chance to purchase mules before the higher scoring ones. When each player's development phase starts, they may get a positive or negative event. Quite a lot of these happen during the game. The manual says they have a 25% chance of occurring on a player's turn, though it certainly feels a bit higher than that. You can only get positive events if you're in last place and negative events if you're in first place. This is where a lot of the world-defining text for the game comes from, and is normally pretty interesting and helps equalize things in the game. Most of these events simply give or take a small amount of money. A few can turn devastating fast, as they are multipliers based on the number of a certain type of mule you have. If you have to spend $100 for every mining mule, and you have 4, you have to pay $400. On the flip side, getting $100 for each food mule you have can be very nice as well. In my opinion, however, the absolute worst event is losing an entire plot of land. This can be devastating to a player that is doing well earlier in the game, as the money spent on the mule at that plot, if any, is also lost. There is the opposite event available, which grants you a plot of land, but that is a nice bonus compared to losing a plot of land, which, if it happens in a chain, can mess up quite a lot. Your development phase begins in the store. There you can purchase mules whose price will fluctuate throughout the game, equip them to produce one of the 4 resources, assay land for crystite deposits, sell unwanted land in the next land auction, or gamble in the pub. If you buy a mule, you also have to outfit it before you can take it out into the world. A mule without equipment does nothing. It costs 25 to outfit it with food, 50 for energy, 75 for smith ore, and 100 for crystite. I'll go into more details about the resources in a bit. If you change your mind about the mule, you can drop it back into the mule corral and get the refund for the mule, albeit without a refund for whatever it is equipped with. Placing mules requires a bit of precision, and if you aren't in the right spot, you may lose a mule. This is one part of the game I wish wasn't actually used, because it isn't obvious where you need to be to place them exactly. If you could just place the mule while standing anywhere on the right plot, that would be great. Mules you already have on a plot may be moved, re-outfitted, or sold back to the store as well. To assay land, you go to the assay building, go out to the plot, press the button, and come back, and it will tell you the level of crystite that is there. If you assay land for crystite, everybody else can see it. Most of the time, I just let the AI spend time searching for the crystite spots. I almost never sell land because you generally can use a stray plot of land for something. You simply walk into the land building, then go out to the plot, press the button to choose it, and then go back to the land building to complete the deal. When selling a plot of land, it will appear as a special kind of auction after the next land grant phase, where you can control the base selling price. Going into the pub, you'll gamble and somehow always make a profit. You'll get more money based on which month it is and how much time you have remaining. Going to the pub also ends your turn, so be sure you're done or too low on time to continue before heading in. A lot of the time, you won't have much to do on your development phase. If that's the case and you want to do more than just hop straight into the pub, you can try to catch a mountain wampus. This appears as a little dot at the base of a random mountain for brief moments, making a soft sound when it's peeking out. While you're moving and it's not looking out at the time, it may stop appearing and a different one from a different mountain may peek out instead, kind of like red light, green light. This makes it a little tricky to approach since it only shows for a random amount of time each time. However, if you catch one, it'll give you its treasure chest, worth more later in the game it is, to set him free. You can try to do this multiple times on a turn, but it's hard to catch more than one. The next phase after development is production. Production is where the mules will produce resources. Depending on the type of mule, whether it has energy or not, what plots are adjacent to it, and how many total plots of that type you have, it will produce more or less of the resource. When production starts, any newly placed mules will have between 0 and 4 tiny dots appear under the symbol. This represents the strength of production for that type of mule on that plot of land, though what you get is also somewhat random based on this. You will also produce an additional unit for each non-diagonally adjacent plot of land with the same type of mule, and another additional unit for every 3 plots anywhere with the same type of mule. If you have 3 smith ore mines and 2 are next to each other, they will all get an extra resource, and the 2 adjacent ones will get an additional extra resource. However, the maximum a plot can produce in a turn is still 8 units. These are shown divvied out across the board in a semi-random fashion. These can actually be a bit tense at times as you keep staring at your new crystite spot, hoping it will produce plenty of resources. Come on, crystite! There is always an event that will occur either before or after production, depending on the event. Some events happen at the beginning of production if they will affect how much production there is. These are events like acid rainstorms, which increases food production but halves energy production, planet quakes that have mining production, and sometimes a mountain may shift plots and take out any mules on those plots, or radiation which makes a mule go crazy and run off. Other events happen after production because they may influence production that just occurred, such as a pest showing up to eat someone's food production, or the dreaded pirates coming along and stealing everybody's crystite. The random events that pick on a single player usually happen only to the first or second place player. One exciting event to have near the beginning of the game is a fire in the store. This means that the inventory of the store is lost, which makes it easy to corner a market of food or energy since generally one of them will be lacking overall. After production comes the auction phase. Here you can buy and sell resources. The base prices are set by the store based on how much inventory there is, the demand for the resource, and what resource it is. A bar graph will show how much everybody produced. If the resource is food or energy, it will show usage and spoilage before showing production, and then show estimates for how much you need for the next turn by using the total food you can use for the next development phase, or adding 1 to the energy you need, assuming you'll get another mule. This is important to know if you are planning on purchasing more than 1 non-energy mules on the next turn. You choose whether you are buying or selling for each auction. Buyers are on the bottom, sellers are on the top. If the store has no inventory and there are no sellers, the auction ends immediately. Once the auction begins, buyers can purchase by moving up, increasing the price they're willing to pay as they move up, and sellers can sell, decreasing their sell price as they move down. When the two meet, they start trading units. If multiple buyers meet with a seller at the same time, or vice versa, the lowest scoring players get to go first. If a buyer runs out of money, an alert about the buyer being strapped for cash will appear and they will be out of the auction. If a seller runs out of a product to sell, they will be out of the auction as well. Alternatively, if a seller hits the end of their surplus for food or energy, they will be taken out of the auction as if they ran out, but they can choose to sell more if they feel it is worth going below their own needed amount for the next month. Sometimes it's worth it when somebody is trying to buy from you at a really high price. Speaking of paying higher prices, if there's no stock in the store and no seller is currently offering a price to sell, buyers can push up the maximum price by pushing up past the top. Their price will keep moving up, allowing them to bid higher and higher for something they really want, which had better be food or energy because this makes no sense for smith ore and certainly not for crystite. If anybody else was bidding, but they're also not pushing up, they will slide down because the auction field is relative, so their asking price will be forced down visually. Because buyers can force the price up like this, food or energy is occasionally so valuable that you can make a huge profit if you were the only player with very much to sell. There is a timer to keep auctions from taking too long, which stops while transactions are occurring and goes much slower while a player is moving. If nobody moves, the timer counts down very quickly. This phase is where you should be making most of your money. Through playing the game, you'll learn ways to manipulate the market to make more of a profit. This can include things like buying out the food from the store when nobody else is making any, or buying someone else's crystite when it's really cheap. One feature I never realized was in the game is called collusion. This allows 2 or more players to engage in a private auction and is activated by pressing the button at the same time on each applicable controller. It can even be done for selling land as well, giving you the opportunity to sell a plot of land to a specific user. It is only available in tournament games. The last phase, Status Summary, is just a status report for you to compare with everyone else. The score is tallied in a straightforward way. Money is obvious, it's the cash you have on hand. Land is 500 points per plot, plus the cost of equipping whatever mule is on that plot of land. Mules do not offer point values themselves. The value of goods is based on the store's current buying price for that commodity. If there is a message about the colony, such as there being a shortage of food, it will scroll at the bottom of the status list. Because the goods value is the same as the store's buying price for that turn, there's no point in selling anything on the last month of the game. The AI certainly never does it, and it wouldn't benefit anybody at all to do it, so technically there shouldn't even be an auction phase on the last month. Maybe it exists just to show you what everything is worth at the end? There are 4 resources you can ascertain while playing the game. You will need to continuously keep a stock of 2 of them, food and energy, as they are used every turn. At the start of the game, everybody has 4 food and 2 energy, enough to just get you started. Food is consumed by your character every turn to give you time during the development phase. For the maximum amount of time available, it takes 3 food for months 1 through 4, 4 food for months 5 through 8, and 5 food for months 9 through 12. This is to account for there being a lot more to do in the later months since you will have many more plots to deal with. If you have 0 food, you only have enough time on your turn to hop into the pub. Food starts at a selling value of 15 and seems to have no upper limit for what it can go for. I've seen it sell for over $200 at a time and definitely take advantage of that opportunity when it arises. Food does spoil over time, however, so it's hard to keep a supply of it. You cannot place food mules on mountains. If you place a food mule on the river, they get 4 production. Otherwise, if you place one on a plain spot, they get 2 production. Energy is used to power your mules. Mules can only produce if you have 1 energy available from a previous turn to power each of them, with the exception of energy mules which power themselves. If you don't have enough energy to go around, then random mules will not receive energy and they will produce nothing during the production phase. In my opinion, energy is far more important than food. You need it to produce anything else, including food. If you have no food but plenty of energy, at least your mules will keep doing their job, you just won't be able to modify or add them. Energy's price starts at 10, and like food, it doesn't seem to have an upper limit should there be a shortage. It is harder to corner the market on energy since everybody ends up needing quite a lot of it, so they would be foolish to ignore it. Still, I have seen it get rather valuable at times. Energy also spoils like food, but at a much slower rate. Energy is the only resource you can place anywhere. It produces 3 on the plains, 2 on rivers, and 1 on mountains. Smith ore is what the store uses to produce mules. It takes 2 smith ore for every mule. If no one decides to produce smith ore in the game, then the colony is going to be doomed since you will run out of mules completely. You cannot place smith ore mules on the water. Otherwise, they get 1 point of production plus 1 for every mountain on their plot. On an empty plain spot, they get 1 production, but on a plot with 3 mountains, they get 4. Smith ore defaults to $50 each, but it can go down to as low as $14 when there are plenty of mules available, and go far higher if there aren't. Generally, smith ore is a slow but safe profit to make, and this is likely why the AI often will go for it. If nobody else is going for smith ore and you are, I recommend holding on to it until the mules start getting rare, and selling when the prices start going up. Crystite is the hardest resource to get in the game because it is hidden. When you start the game, 3 plots are chosen on the map to be high crystite spots. Every non-diagonal adjacent plot to that which has no or low crystite is set to medium crystite. Every non-diagonal adjacent plot to those which has no crystite is set to low crystite. This makes a diamond shape that you can use to easily figure out or at least deduce where the crystite spots are from just a couple of them being assayed. Realize that the high spots may overlap, so there may appear to be only 1 or 2, and they can even be on a river or under the store where you can't mine for them. High spots give 3 production for crystite, mediums give 2, and lows give 1. Anything else has a 0. Only a random event which seems to occur in most games can give you 4 production for crystite, and that is a meteorite landing. This is the only random event where, if it picks on you and decides to take out one of your mules, you're generally glad it happened. Every turn, crystite will sell for a completely random amount between $50 and $150. When it is low, you hold on to it, waiting for the price to go up. When it's high, generally over $100, it's time to sell. Since it never spoils, just like smith ore, you can tempt fate and hold on to it, hoping the pirates event won't show up and steal it all. At the end of the game, if you have a total colony score over 60,000, the first player is the first founder, or in other words, the winner. Then you get a message about how successful your colony was. If you got under 60,000, everybody will be shipped off to work in a mule factory. Otherwise, you can live comfortably or in luxury depending on how much you make. An entire game tends to take about 60 to 90 minutes. Here's where I have to confess that, as much as I've played this game, I'm not very good at helping the entire colony score out. I tend to have trouble even worrying about doing well myself, especially dealing with the random events. Trying to get a high total for the colony is just not something I've ever figured out how to do effectively. I'm sure someone will come along and hear this and think, well, geez, you just need to do this or that. Oh well, I enjoy playing the game as it is, and I don't need a super high score to have fun. There are 2 other difficulties in the game which just simplify things by removing features. They are designed to make it easier to learn how to play the game. They are Standard and Beginner. The Standard game changes the following. Crystite is not available. Meteorites do nothing positive. Pirates steal smith ore instead of crystite. The timing for the land grant is a little slower. You have more time during production. There is no auction collusion, and the AI does not get $200 extra. These changes make the game a lot simpler, and this is what I recommend to introduce players to the game, or to play with it being a little less cutthroat as the full game can be. The beginner game simplifies the game even further based on the standard rules. There are only 6 months instead of 12. The timing for the land grant is very slow. There are no land auctions. You cannot sell land. When you press the button to place mules on a plot, it is very generous. I wish this feature was applied to all difficulty levels, as this feels like an arcade-like difficulty to add to a non-arcade game. You cannot sell when you have no surplus. Buyers can no longer increase the price above the initial maximum. The pool of mules is infinite, and they only cost $100 at all time, and placing a mule instantly shows its productivity level. This game mode is so simple, I was able to play it without problems back when I was only 5 or 6, just after the game came out. I remember enjoying it even back then, especially since I could play it with my mother, or later with my sister or brother. I only recommend someone plays the game in this mode if they're playing with young children, so long as they understand how numbers work and can read a little, and even then they might just have fun doing silly things as opposed to actually playing the game. Each player's character is pretty simple. You pick a color and your race out of the list of 8. Each race has a silly description to go with it. The only races that change anything are the Flapper, which gives you plus $600 as a beginner race, and the Humanoid, which gives you minus $400 as an expert race. The Mechtrons are only special in that the AI always picks them. While playing, they all look very different and also make different sounds while they're moving, which you can hear during the development phase or during any auctions. There is nothing else that distinguishes one race or character from another. M.U.L.E was designed from the very beginning to be a multiplayer game. It takes advantage of the 4 joystick ports on the Atari 800 computers to allow up to 4 players to play together. In many cases, Atari users may only have paddles available, which can only turn or press a button, and can't do a full range of movement. These users would have to borrow the actual joystick to move during the development phase, which is the only phase where you need full control over just up and down and the button. During auctions, they could just turn the paddle for up and down. The unfortunate thing is that the later Ataris removed the additional joystick ports to save costs, so only up to 2 players could play, well, technically 3 if you had a paddle controller set, since 2 share the same port. This is how I've always played the game since we never had an older Atari 800. When you do not have 4 human players, the remaining player slots are filled in with computer-controlled opponents. They will always play as Mechtrons, the robot race. In tournament mode, they also start with $200 more than human players. The AI is tolerable and at least a bit finicky. They are not great at playing the game, but they are sufficient, particularly regarding the amount of processing power available at the time. They do not tend to win simply by their tactics, but rather by a series of random events that hurts everyone else and benefits them. This does highlight how quite a bit of randomness can make or break a game at times, unfortunately. They have tendencies to purchase way too much smith ore and ignore other resources. Unless they happen to own respectable crystite spots, then they go crazy on the crystite. Playing with 2 AIs like I've always done, you tend to see at least one of them just loading up on smith ore. They generally ignore food and energy, seeming to prefer to just purchase it since it is usually fairly cheap. This also makes it so you can generally defeat them once you know about it. You can make a sufficient living with AI around just by having plenty of food or energy. This is especially true if you, or even the AI, buy out all of the stock in the store, or there is a fire in the store event. Food generally does far better, but since everybody needs 1 energy for every non-energy plot they own, after the first couple of turns everybody needs more energy. The AI does some interesting things though. For example, sometimes one of them will buy out all of the food or energy in the store if it looks like the colony has a shortage. This would make sense if that AI then produced large amounts of whatever commodity they bought up and tried to cash in on the price increase. After all, food is the cheapest thing to equip a mule to produce, only $25 per mule. Instead, if they change anything at all, they seem to quickly forget about the entire thing and switch right back to smith ore or crystite. Other times, if you are racing an AI opponent to purchase a plot, they sometimes will dive back down in price right before the timer runs out, making you purchase the land instead of them. This is actually pretty clever because oftentimes you'll be fighting them for the purchase just to force them to pay more, not because you wanted that land, and then suddenly they pull this on you and you're the sucker out of a lot of money for a plot of land. Sometimes you can even force the AI to sell at lower prices by waiting it out. After all, that energy isn't going to do the AI any good if they don't sell it. Wait, only 1? The music for M.U.L.E is probably my favorite old game tune. It is very unique and memorable, and I've had it in my playlist since I started having one. I even use it as the ringtone on my phone. There are also 3 short songs in the game for you when you have a positive or negative event on your turn, and when you win at gambling. It is really obvious when you hear that something bad just happened, versus to let you know something good just happened. Whenever you go to the pub, you hear a brief modified version of the theme song. The sound is nothing exceptional, but at this time, games were just starting to incorporate much sound in them. You get different tones for different actions of the game, little rising and lowering sounds for the bars for production usage spoilage, a ticking sound when time is running out, and so on. The sounds fill out the game and made it feel more complete. And every alien race has a unique sound when they walk around, which is a nice added touch. I first played M.U.L.E on beginner mode with my mother when I was about 5 or 6 years old, after she had already gained some proficiency in it. As always, she was very patient with me and made it fun to learn the game. It took a few plays to eventually move on to standard and finally tournament difficulty. Since we had an Atari 800 XL, we only had 2 joystick ports, so we could only play with 2 players at a time. Once my older sister and my brother were older, it would have been nice for us to have 4-player games of it. When I was a kid, we had a copy of M.U.L.E that was apparently hacked by somebody named Dean. Instead of the planet Irata, it was the planet Dino. Instead of Smithor, it was Deanzor, and instead of Christite, it was Deanzite. I can't find this version at all, or even a mention of it anywhere, so who knows if it got around much. We had the original version as well. The creators of the game mentioned they drew some inspiration for the game from Monopoly. Though M.U.L.E may have random events and a bit of luck is required to do incredibly well, the game is still heavily strategy-based. You, the player, decide what you do pretty much from the beginning. You choose which spot you want to get every turn, and you choose what commodity or commodities to build, how you buy and sell, and so on. None of these choices exist in Monopoly, where just about the entire game is decided by dice. The only choice you tend to have is whether to buy an unknown plot or not, or where and when to buy houses. Alan Watson, the artistic director and interface programmer for M.U.L.E, wanted to have a similar feeling of picking the piece that represents you in the game, which is why there is a selection of a race at the beginning which is mostly just cosmetic. If you're not going for the flapper for more money or the humanoid for less, then you had 6 to choose from. My mom usually played the Gollumer, as it reminded her of E.T., one of her favorite movies. My brother always chose the Packer, though I have no idea why. I guess because they loved food so much or because of the huge head. I tended to choose the Spheroid since it's such an impractical looking creature. I mean, it isn't bouncing or anything, so how's it moving? If it was rolling, its head would surely spin too, right? The impractical way it rolls must somehow help go through the mountains and catch the Wampus easier. Yeah, that's totally the reason to choose the Spheroid. In any case, I may have played Monopoly a total of 12 times, and it's never been a particularly enjoyable experience. I've probably played around 100 games of M.U.L.E and still enjoy it. Since my parents got rid of all of our Atari stuff around 1994-ish, I didn't get to play any of these great old games until much later. It wasn't until I found the Atari 800 Win emulator in about 2002-ish that I got to play them again. I wanted to play M.U.L.E with my wife, my girlfriend at the time. She had never played it before and enjoyed it right off the bat. I'm glad that emulators exist to allow everybody the chance to play these great old games, because sometimes there's really nothing like them. I wonder if I could get a 4-player game of this going with my board gaming group, since it's similar enough to a board game. While preparing this script, I read the manual for the first time, since we didn't have it when I was a kid. This is how I found out about collusion, and had to go back and play some more to try it out. At least I enjoy this game, so that wasn't a bad thing. As I said earlier, this is my favorite 8-bit game, and I highly recommend it to anybody that enjoys competitive strategy games or even strategic board games. The Commodore 64 version is very similar to the Atari 8-bit version, which makes sense since it came out shortly afterwards. I don't know how many of these differences or oddities are due to the emulator, since I don't have a real Commodore to compare to like I can with the Atari. The most noticeable differences are the sounds and music, which are mostly very different. The little tick-tock countdown sounds nifty here, and I really liked the way the Acid Rainstorm event sounded, but I was mostly indifferent to the changes, though the M.U.L.E equipping sound is not that great on the C64. The theme song sounds rather odd, but apparently most other people prefer this version to the Atari version. I still prefer the original myself. Visually, some things are a bit strange. Everything has a washed-out look to it compared to the Atari version, and I don't know why they decided to use a light gray dollar values on a slightly lighter gray background, though it only gets that way when showing spoilage and surpluses. It looks like one of those badly designed websites I see a lot of, where the text is only supposed to be hinted at, not actually read. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same game on the Commodore 64. The PC version of the game came out 2 years later, in 1985. EGA with 16 colors had just been introduced, and the game did not take advantage of that. Instead, the game is done completely in CGA, which means a limitation of 4 colors. To get around this, alternating colors were used. You have purple with white, purple with black, cyan with white, and cyan with black as the 4 colors. It takes a little getting used to. This version was very hard to find. This is apparently due to it having very limited distribution. Someone, not too long ago, received a number of old PC floppies, and amongst them was a disc for M.U.L.E. A disc image was made and distributed online, and this is what I ended up finding after quite a bit of searching. The disc image is also a bit hard to use. Instead of just copying to a hard drive, it has its own proprietary format. You have to boot from the floppy, which is easy enough to do in DOSBox, it's just a bit weird. It is very clear right away that this is not a faithful remake of the game. It was actually created by K-Byte, who I only know about from their game Mountain King from 1983. Before long, you'll notice that the AI actually catches the Wampus. Not only that, but the dollar amounts the AI gets for doing so are ridiculous. $300 on month 1, $900 on month 5, and $1,000 on month 6, for example. You never get more than $500 in the original, and that was on the last month or two. And the AI is far better at it than I am. I had trouble even telling where the Wampus was on the screen, let alone actually catching the darn thing. The first couple of months only require 2 food instead of 3. The AI plays differently, far more conservatively. It purchased a lot more food and energy than normal, to the point where they were always dirt cheap. There isn't even enough time in the land auctions to outbid whoever's on top, and so on. The setup on the keyboard is strange. I thought that using the arrow keys would be the straightforward way to play, with enter or space or something for the button. Instead, the up arrow counts as the button, except during development when it's enter. I didn't learn this until a ways in, so I kept getting my plots in the wrong spot as I frantically pressed keys hoping to get it to work. However, the game was fairly unresponsive most of the time, so I'm not even fairly certain I got that right. Exiting the store, for example, requires you to let go of the keys and press them again to start moving. It didn't maintain their state between those. And then there were the timing issues. So many timing issues. This is actually probably the fault of DOSBox not letting me to choose the 8086's timing, but since the game wasn't coded to support a range of processor speeds, it probably won't ever act correctly. So many things were too fast or too slow, and I had to keep juggling with the cycles. At 300 cycles, most of the parts of the game where you're moving felt alright, but animated sections like the status section or the acid storm event were really slow this way. But even at 300, there was only about a quarter second to choose whether you wanted to buy or sell for an auction. And none of that touches on how awful the internal speaker is for handling the audio. While the theme song is just a bizarre mess, the sounds are all rather inconsistent, not particularly interesting, and there's just so much less sound. In fact, I could keep going on about how unfun the experience was with this port, but I think you get the idea. I was frustrated trying to play this. I gave up on turn 6 when I accidentally pressed up to sell instead of buy at the wrong time because I mistimed around the quarter-second prompt to buy or sell. In any case, this is by far my least favorite version of the game. It was ported to the PC, sure, but unfortunately so much of the life has been sucked out of it. In 1990, Ozark Softscape released an NES version of the game. It may look a little better to some people, but I did not care about the aesthetic of it. For the most part, the core elements of the game remain the same. You still make mules, place plots, and so on, but so many things look different, it's a bit distracting to someone who's played the original so much. Plots of land don't have border colors, making it a bit harder to tell who owns what plots. The points rack up for how much you have produced in really strange places, and there's no longer a designator for how good a mule is at doing the job required for the plot. Catching the Wampus is far easier. Once it starts blinking, it's very easy to catch it every time. But all it does is give you some text about it instead of the full screen switch in the original version. You can also catch it several times without problems. The store is way different. There's no longer a zoom in or out effect going into and out of it. There's just a bunch of metal doors and very dull menus with very awful sound effects. It takes a lot longer to get around in this store, and there's no advantage to coming at it from above or below now. You can't leave it out the bottom, you have to go all the way to the left or right to get out. Buying a mule requires walking into the mule corral door, then choosing to buy a mule from the menu, which makes a sound like something bad just happened. Outfitting one makes a generic chimey sound. Which leads to the biggest problem I had with this game, the sound. Picking a race now has a goofy voice.
Welcome, Green Leroy.
It'll say this every time your turn starts, well, without the welcome part. This is the only quote-unquote improvement in the sound, though I found it rather out of place. The sound of the ship landing and taking off are reused for the store doors opening and closing. The sound for outfitting a mule is used whenever an auction starts, and so on. However, the complete lack of sound through most of the game is just sad. Land claims, the entirety of the AI taking its turn, and auctions other than the starting chime are all done in complete silence. Positive and negative events are also silent. When you're taking your turn, the only sounds are from interacting with the store and the wampus. This lack of sound makes the game feel hollow and incomplete. The theme song in this version sounds very Nintendo-y, which the creators possibly couldn't get around, but it is no longer very unique sounding. All in all, I really didn't care for the NES version, but at least it is playable and follows the same rules as the original game, whereas the PC version is almost impossible to play. If you are interested in playing the game but do not want to deal with emulators, there are two, well, technically three options available. I have not played any of these, so I cannot comment on how well they work or how accurate they are to the original game. There is a modern Java-based client that has been created and is available on planetmule.com. It allows playing the game with other players online and works in Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. They also have rankings, a Hall of Fame, and weekly top 10s. There is also a remake done for iOS and Android devices that came out fairly recently called M.U.L.E Returns. It costs $3 from the Google Play Store or Apple Store. Thankfully, it does not have microtransactions or other purchases being constantly shoved in your face, quite unlike most other phone games. The old school version of the theme song they are playing in their ads is the Commodore 64 version. There is also now a board game based on M.U.L.E that came out in 2015. I have not played the board game, so I don't know how accurate it is to the game, though I certainly have debated picking it up. There are pretty much no games that are anything like M.U.L.E, except perhaps Off-World Trading Company, released in 2016. This game is a real-time economics game where you harvest resources and buy and sell them in an ever-changing marketplace. The game even has a M.U.L.E event in it where it clearly points out where its inspiration comes from, complete with a mention of a Dr. Bunton, referring to Dan Bunton, who was the designer for M.U.L.E. This game is multiplayer as well, but it's just not as fun to play as M.U.L.E. There's also a reference to M.U.L.E in Spore from 2008. In the space age, when you want to trade, at a very low chance a modified version of the M.U.L.E theme plays in the background. I wish I was joking when I said it took me 7 hours to get this video from a game I don't even like. And it sounds like the Commodore 64 version as well, with a different percussion sound. Why does everybody copy the C64 version? M.U.L.E apparently only sold about 30,000 copies, though it was very popular. Unfortunately, it was widely pirated, so the original developers did not make anywhere near as much as they could have from the game. This is yet another example why games started having copy protection of varying sorts added to them. M.U.L.E was the first game put out under the Ozark Softscape name. The Seven Cities of Gold from 1984 was their largest success, which came out the following year, and sold over 100,000 copies. Ozark Softscape had a dispute with Electronic Arts over porting games to the NES in 1990, and then partnered with Mindscape to release M.U.L.E on the NES, and later with Microplay to release two later games, Commander HQ from 1990 and Global Conquest in 1992. A further dispute occurred with Sega over trying to port M.U.L.E to the Genesis in 1993, because Sega wanted to add guns and bombs to the game to, quote, bring it up to date. Dan Bunton refused to do so, which, while I totally agree that was a stupid request, unfortunately caused the company to disband. Dan Bunton, credited with being the creator of the game, had sex reassignment surgery in 1992 and has since been known as Daniel Bunton Berry, or Danny for short. This has led to a bit of confusion on my part, since when I found out in 1998 that Danny had died of lung cancer and was considered one of the lead women in computer gaming in the 80s, including making M.U.L.E, I was confused because I couldn't remember her name from any games, let alone M.U.L.E. Women programmers would stand out because there were so few of them. So many programmers were named Bill or Dan that they did not stand out. It wasn't until researching for this video I found out why there was this disconnect. Danny created many great computer games back in the day, in particular M.U.L.E and The Seven Cities of Gold, which have always stood out in my mind as two of the most original games ever created. Other games she created include Cartels and Cutthroats from 1981, Robot Rascals from 1986, which was one of the first multiplayer-only games, Modem Wars from 1988, which was one of the first modem-based games, and Global Conquest from 1992. I know very little about Bill Bunton, not even what his role was in making the game, and I can't find anything about him online. Searching for Bill Bunton always comes up with Mayor Bill Bunton from Kansas that would have been in his 50s when M.U.L.E came out, or more articles about Danny Bunton. His strategy guide in the manual makes him sound like a bit of a trickster. That's about the only hint at who he was I can find, other than one article mentioning he was Danny's brother and that the woman on the inside of the M.U.L.E package was apparently their sister. Jim Rushing seems to have been the lead programmer for the game. After Ozark broke up, Jim Rushing was hired at Electronic Arts. He went on to mostly produce games, almost exclusively sports games. As best as I can tell, Jim Rushing still works there and is the largest pusher of Agile there. He is also a horsemanship instructor for Stanford University. Alan Watson specialized on the interface and graphics code. Again, I have a lot of trouble finding anything about Alan. There are many other people with his name or similar names. I did find a podcast with an interview with Alan from 2015. The link is included. This mostly just talks about his thoughts on the games they made and how they created them. During the interview, he mentions that he works on electronics and making customizations for planes for very wealthy clients. Roy Glover, who doesn't even show up in the credits for the Atari 8-bit version, made the catchy music that came with it. He also did the music for Seven Cities of Gold as well. Aside from that, I can't find anything out about him, what else he has done, or whether or not he's even still alive. It seems a bit silly to talk about what happened to a company as big as Electronic Arts. They're currently the second largest gaming company, and you have only not heard of them if you haven't been a part of the gaming community pretty much since they started selling games back in 1982. We didn't call them EA back then, we called them ECA. I do remember on the Atari being excited seeing a game with their ECA logo. It's actually a square, circle, and a triangle, but I didn't even know that until far later. And yes, they weren't actually supposed to be ECA, but that's what everybody I knew called them for short. The games they published back then were usually top tier, and many of them were worth getting. So many of these are going to show up in this series. M.U.L.E, of course, Archon from 1983, The Seven Cities of Gold from 84, Mail Order Monsters from 85, Lords of Conquest 1986, The Bard's Tale from 1985 or 87 for the Atari ST, and Populous from 1989, if we only include the ones from the 80s. On the Atari 8-bit, most of their games came in LP-like packages. You would open them up and see details about the people behind the game. It was meant to represent actual LPs, making the game designers look like rock stars. The LP game packages were an awesome idea, and I wish something like this had continued beyond the 8-bit era.